Thanks to all of you for being here with us tonight, to our Smithsonian colleague, Rebecca, who is with us from just down the road at NMAI, and our guest of honor, Dyani White Hawk, for coming in from Minneapolis to be with us this evening. I think my job at first is to set the scene a little bit for this talk, which is a convergence of a few different threads. And initially, when the Hirshhorn was planning this program, we were planning it in the context of this painting, which is upstairs, as Evelyn just mentioned, in the exhibition Revolutions, that I will also plug our curator colleagues, Marina Iskro and Betsy Johnson, for, because it's a beautiful, beautiful presentation. As you can see, this is a square painting. It's 36 by 36 inches. It's acrylic on canvas with alternating bands of color and what looks on the big screen and from a distance like sort of cream colored. When you're standing in front of the painting, however, you get a lot more information immediately, and I hope all of you, if you've not yet had a chance to see the work, will have time to do so. So the first thing you'll notice is that these thick horizontal bands of color and light color are delineated by a narrow strip of 24 karat gold seed beads that are stitched into the canvas and sit on the surface in relief. And the second thing, as you can see from this detail, is that the cream is not really cream, nor is it uniform at all. What you're seeing are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands, of individual paint strokes, vertical short paint strokes in an array of lighter colors, blue grays and corals and creams that are set over a gold backdrop, which kind of peeks through in various places. These strokes are meant to evoke porcupine quillwork, which is a beading tradition that is core to Dyani's practice and shows up in many areas of her work. We realized, however, that we are in a unique and really lucky position at the Smithsonian because this is not the only work of Dyani's that is currently on view in DC. There is this work as well, this series of screen prints titled Takes Care of Them from 2019 that is currently installed, that again, we'll encourage you all to go see at the National Museum of the American Indian, and Rebecca is the curator who worked to bring these works into that collection and install them. So bringing this conversation or bringing this all together in a single conversation was exciting, I think, because together not only do these works demonstrate more of a range of everything that Dyani is doing in a very active and very multidisciplinary practice, but also because the fact that these two individual works could be acquired and shown by two institutions that carry quite distinct missions, one from the other, and work in both of these contexts is interesting and notable. And the fact that these works work in both spaces is something that I think we're really excited to discuss tonight. And so it's, again, a pleasure to have you both here. And I wanted to begin, Dyani, by asking you just to talk us through the story of these individual works. Perhaps first the painting and then the prints, and through that we can maybe start tapping into some of the larger themes that are fundamental to the work that you do.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Before I describe the works, I guess I just want to start by saying thank you. You know, I'm really glad to be here. I'm really excited to be here. I got to take in a whole lot of artwork in less than 24 hours. So, and that's important. You know, oftentimes we're so inundated with our own work or so immersed in our own work that we don't take the time to get out and, do the soul-filling, research and travel and all of the things that you need to keep going as an artist. And sometimes you have to be forced into it. So this is one of those moments, and I'm really grateful. And it was really a treat to tour the second floor, upstairs. We went upstairs to the Revolutions exhibition. That was really filled my heart too, and I'm grateful for everybody that made that happen. And I was this is why I'm confused with the floors, because on the third floor at NMAI, to also walk in to see the prints, so to go to 2 different institutions at this time and to see the works in places that I want, I really want the work to be in the conversations at NMAI, and I really want the work to be in the conversations here. And that's what I've been working towards for a really long time. So it's really fulfilling for me to come here and go to both those spaces and to see that happening. So, Wopila, I'm really grateful to everyone to help on that journey. And for all of you coming to hang out with us tonight. So, thank you. Okay, so let's see here. Let's see if I can condense my practice into the description of these 2 works. Yeah. So this particular piece, Untitled, Red and Orange, is an evolution of, I think, a number of different bodies of work and a kind of convergence of the way that I've played through a few different bodies of work, and all kind of culminated into this piece in a fairly unique way. This is really, at this time anyways, fairly singular. Like this, a lot of my work, I work in series, and there'll be multiple pieces that speak to each other over time. A lot of times when I create a piece even, it will have like a partner piece. I often create pieces that speak to each other. But this one so far is the one and only. So far. I'll leave room that maybe that'll change in the future. But there's a body of work that I started in 2016 that's called the Quiet Strength series. So to dial back to tell you where that came from, my practice is really grounded in painting, beadwork, and porcupine quillwork. I do a lot of different things. Sometimes the work is in video, and sometimes it's installation, and so sometimes it's been performance, but it's really rooted in painting and the practices of beadwork, and rooted in abstraction. And for me, my practice is rooted first and foremost in the practices of Lakota abstraction. So in the practices of parfleche painting, so abstract painting on stretched rawhide as opposed to on stretched canvas, in the practices of porcupine quillwork, and in the practices of beadwork, which were and are practices in Lakota artistic traditions historically that were upheld by women, and that continue today and are practiced by all sorts of folks, because our ways of living have really been completely uprooted. But so gender roles have changed and become way more fluid in current structures than they were previously. But historically, the practices of Lakota abstraction was a practice that was upheld predominantly by women in our tribe. And so I pull first and foremost from that history. I went to tribal colleges. So I went to Haskell Indian Nations University for my associate's degree, and then I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts for my bachelor's degree, and then I went back into mainstream academia and got my master's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I studied, and I tell you that because I studied art history from an Indigenous perspective before I studied art history from a Western perspective. So my early years of coming into studying and practicing art, even in an academic setting, was in a tribal college. And then later in graduate school, I had to play catch up and learn what everybody else in academia was learning. And it was at that time that I was studying practices of abstraction from a European and European American perspective. And it was during that time that I was learning. Basically, what I honed in on was the intersections of those practices, because for me, I got to mainstream academia, and I was really trying to find my footing and figure out like where I fit in that space, especially coming from these places of like such strength in Indigenous education. And I got to graduate school, and I had not learned the same thing that all my peers had learned. And my peers had not learned all the same things that I had learned. And so I got there, and there was like was challenging for me to at first I was like, I can't talk to these people, and they don't know what I'm talking about, and it was like I had, you know, a bit of a mental breakdown in the beginning, but because of that, I had to like dig in and figure out how I was going to make that system work for me and how I fit in that space. And so as I was studying Western art history and easel painting, and like most naturally attracted to easel painting in abstraction, and then I started honing in on the specificity of like the areas that I was most interested in. And I kept coming across, I would read, you know, I'd find a painter that I really loved, and I was like, oh man, I dig these paintings, you know, and I would like, I'd start reading about that artist, and I'd be like, oh, and they just, you know, happened to be a collector, and they were looking at Indigenous art forms, and that kept happening over and over and over again, and I was like, well, that's why I keep falling in love with these painters, because I can aesthetically see, and I'm like aesthetically connecting to things that are coming out in their work that connect to my aesthetic preferences that are informed by our artistic histories. And so I would be attracted to that because it looks like our work, right? Or it harkens to it in some format that I think I was seeing, right? Even if I didn't understand it until I started reading it. And so that was the space that I was like, this is what feels interesting to me, because every time the Indigenous artist is represented in the narrative, in the academic narrative of art history, it's as a footnote of, oh, this profoundly great European or European American painter is a genius, and they were looking at this work and look at what they made. And that's how it was simplifying, drastically simplifying, but that's how I read it, you know, and I'm like, it felt like every time that the influences were mentioned, it was like a footnote to support the genius of the easel painter. And I kept reading it, I'm like, yes, but none of the names of the artists, of the people who are making work that is strong enough to inspire you are recognized to the same equivalence. Like, obviously their work has enough agency and power and strength that you are collecting that work, that you are bringing it into your home, that you are taking it into your consciousness, that you are letting it guide your practice in some form, shape, or fashion. That work is great work. But it's not given the same equality as the history of that work is not considered art with a capital A. It's not given the same power. I'm giving a whole history lesson before I get to this painting. I'm sorry. But but so in graduate school, when I was coming to that place and I'm trying to find this formula of how I'm going to make a graduate school studio practice work for me. And in undergraduate, I was taking painting, but I was also doing traditional arts classes. So I was doing beadwork and was like refining my beadwork practices, learning with wonderful people. I learned porcupine quillwork. I hadn't learned quillwork until I got to IAIA, so I learned how to do quillwork while I was there. I was building that skill set. And so my BFA exhibition was paintings and beadwork and quillwork and parfleche work, and it was all of those things. And so then when I got to graduate school in the painting department, I thought I had to paint, and so I painted, and then I was like, oh, I really need to do some beadwork because I crave all of those things. I do all of those things, and so I started exploring how to combine them, and I made a really large triptych that incorporated quillwork, but it was a very slow process. And so I had to figure out how to do this process faster to fit the academic calendar. So I started painting it. I started mimicking it in paint because I needed to like bring the conversations, all of the like teachings that are embedded in quillwork and beadwork, all of the historical significance, the cultural significance, my lived experience, all of that. I needed to bring it forward, but I had to make it fit this format like it had to fit. It had to be fast, right? And so I started painting it. And so for many years, from like 2010 until 2016, I used this line work format that we're looking at, this painted simulation of both porcupine quillwork and lane stitch beadwork, which is a format of really like plain style application of beads that mimic quillwork. and I was doing this in paint. And for years, it would be in a painting as a part of the painting, as like a part of the supporting narrative. And each of the paintings had their own narratives, and it would be an element within it. And then in 2016, I realized that it was strong enough to be the conversation and not just a supporting character. So the Quiet Strength series came out of that, and it was a way for, so the first painting was a square format painting as well, and the underpainting was gold, just like this piece, and the entire foreground of the painting is done in the line work, and this is the third in that series. So these are, and they got bigger. This is 84 by 60 inches, completely covered in the line work. And this is very similar to the first one, only different colors. But so for me, this particular series was about putting in the foreground the phenomenal legacy of Indigenous artists and the gifts that they have given us and the impact that they've had and the contributions that they've made to the artistic history of this land base. And to put that front and center, and in doing it in paint and doing it big, then I can situate it next to the painters that have held that platform for so long and introduce these conversations that recognize not only the strength of those artistic practices and the strength of their work and the strength of their abilities to speak through the format of abstraction, but the way that they've influenced a lot of the painters that we've come to study and respect. And it's painted over fields of gold because I'm trying to play with hierarchies. So we've been taught that we've been taught hierarchies of people, we've been taught hierarchies of art forms, we've been taught hierarchies of materials. We're taught that marble, oil paint, bronze, gold, all of these things are like the highest forms, right? But those materials are associated with groups of people. And so therefore we're taught forms of hierarchy in regards to communities as well. So by burying the field of gold in these brushstrokes that allude to a natural material, porcupine quills, or the labor of beadwork, things that are done in natural materials, in fibers, in glass, in weaving, all of these art forms are often associated with Black and brown communities and women. And we've been taught categorically that those are something else. They're not art with a capital A, they're design, they're craft, they're ethnographic, they're self-taught, they're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this particular piece has come out of the evolution of that Quiet Strength series. And it was really, it was a playful piece because I wanted to play with, I do a lot of striping as well. And so I pull a lot from the histories of color field and stripe painting eras, but the way that those speak to and intersect with Lakota aesthetics and Indigenous aesthetics. So I liked the idea of these three separate bands of color alluding to a gradation that doesn't exist. But like we see it as that. Like when you stand in front of the piece, it feels like a gradation, but it's just three bands of color. And then I do a lot of beadwork on canvas and a lot of beadwork on like mixed media works that incorporate paint and beads. So the 24 karat gold beads as like the kind of bounding box of the quillwork or the beadwork painting motif. I feel like it also harkens to a lot of practices that we do in regalia making and in traditional art forms that utilize beads and sequins and all these things as embellishments. So I also that's the place I come from in a lot of ways too. Like a lot of my work comes from learning how to make our cultural practices, making a dress and making moccasins and making all those things. Where like I learned how to do those things before I learned how to formally paint. So those influences come through. That's a lot of talking for one piece. So I'm going to turn it over, and we'll get back to the takes care of them later.
Well, let's go to takes care of them, and maybe Rebecca, you can talk to us a little bit about these works and how they came into the collection at NMAI, how you see them operating within the context at NMAI.
Sure, yes, and then I'd love to hear Dyani talk a little bit about them too. Takes care of them. These 4 prints are currently on view at NMAI, at the National Museum of the American Indian. They're on the 3rd floor, and maybe we could see the one of the photos that shows them as they're installed. Here we go. So they're on the 3rd floor in an area where we're also showing some other relatively recent acquisitions. So so you can see kind of off to the right, you see that first you see the takes care of them prints at left. A little ways down is a painted diptych by the artist Daphne Ojig. To the right here is a beadwork piece on silk fabric by Terry Greaves. Also close by is an exhibition of the work of Dene artist D.Y. Begay, her woven wool tapestries. And then in the distance, you can see an installation of a pair of gowns that were designed for the actress Lily Gladstone to wear when she was nominated for an Academy Award for her performance in Killers of the Flower Moon. And these were designed by Gucci in collaboration with the quillwork artist Joe Big Mountain. And so I just love that Dyani's prints, which have such incredible attention to detail, something we see throughout your work, attention to the details of the fabric, the felted wool fabric, the dentalium shell yolks at the tops of the dresses. I love that these are in conversation with Terry Greaves' beadwork, with Joe Big Mountain's quillwork, with D.Y. Begay's wool tapestries, as well as with the vibrant colors and the narratives of Daphne Ojig's paintings. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very different conversation than what's happening here, but so important, both of these conversations. Yeah. And I'd love for you to talk a little more about the prints, and then I can talk a little about how they came into our collection, maybe.
Okay, sounds good. So the Takes Care of Them suite they're fairly close to being body size, and they're meant to be, I ask for them to be hung a little bit lower so that when you stand in front of them, you feel this kind of like one-to-one correlation between yourself and these dress forms. I made it at High Point Center for Printmaking in Minneapolis, and they're really unique in the body of my work as well, because my work isn't usually this direct. Like these are dresses, they're still abstracted, but they're direct references to the practice of making Northern Plains women's dentalium dresses. But it was a really natural progression in playing in print and trying to figure out what I wanted to create while I had the opportunity to make prints at High Point. And at first they started with just the yoke, which would really fit with the theme of, the Quiet Strength series and what I had been doing and mimicking this work in paint. And then as we were making them, I was like, I feel like we need a little bit more of like the wool bodice that they would be on, a little bit more of the like color field. And then as we were going, I was like, a little bit more. I'm like, yeah, I need the whole dress. And so they got bigger and bigger as we went. And they were really fun to make because what we did is we printed the backgrounds, and then Cole, the master printmaker at the time, at High Point at the time, would pin them up for me in the back, and I worked on these like I would a dress. So I brought in bags of ribbons and sequins, and I cut out forms that looked like shells, and I did all these things, and I adorned these on the wall like with double-sided sticky tape and laid them out just like I would if I was actually going to make a dress. And so it felt like a one-to-one correlation of dress design. And so for me, the 4 of these are representative of relatives, and the Takes Care of Them suite is meant to recognize, again, the strength of our female relatives and the way the importance of their roles in caring for our communities. I was thinking about my mom, and I was thinking about the way, I can't even remember, I may get to this later, but so there's a ceremony, the Hamblecha ceremony, which is welcoming home of adopted and foster relatives, and in that ceremony, they ask veterans to stand at the 4 cardinal directions to kind of like protect the space, right? And veterans have a really revered, honored space in our communities. And I don't know if you guys know this, but per capita, Native people have the highest volunteer rates for service in the nation, right? Which, considering the way that our communities have been treated by the US government, is profound, right? And so we really, you know, in the like beginning of every powwow, veterans just, they have such a frontal honored space in our communities. And so that recognition is built in, right? And I got to thinking about the way that our female relatives stand guard and protect our spaces in ways that are equal to the ways that our male relatives have done that in, you know, in those positions of service. And they do the same thing, right? But it might be in different formats, but they stand guard and they protect us and they care for us and they nurture us. And that collection of care from both male and female and every relative is equally as important, right? And so I wanted to create this piece, this suite of prints that to me speaks to female relatives and the way that they take care of us. And so I see them as generations and as relatives. So for me, the blue dress is the unchi, it's the grandma, and it's the oldest style in its adornment. It harkens back to just the ways that these dresses would have been adorned earlier in time. And then the yellow one is, she's the blingiest of the crew. It's gold, it's not yellow, it's actually gold ink, so it's really like bright and vibrant, and it's got the bright ribbons, and it alludes to a style right now in ribbon dresses where there's a lot, it's subtle, but it alludes to a style in ribbon skirts and dresses that have a lot of fringe and hang. It's just, they're just greater in embellishment, right? So she's the young relative. She's like your young auntie, your young cool auntie. And then the green dress is meant to be the like older auntie that maybe like holds things just a little bit more serious, but she's a real like fierce protector. And the red dress is my mom. So this is the nurturer, you know? So they each have Lakota and English titles that are lead, create, protect, and nurture. And so it just speaks to the different roles of our female relatives. And yeah, I'll leave that out.
Sure, and so I, of course, have been following Dyani's work for many years. We have an earlier painting in our collection, too, that I think we'll see a little bit later. But I was really excited by the opportunity to acquire these prints for our collection. Not only are they just, you know, stunningly beautiful works, you know, visually stunning works, they, I really appreciated the power of the story that you told about them, your interest in honoring the roles the strength of women and the roles that women take on in Indigenous communities and families, you know, these nurturing, caring, leading, protecting roles. I also appreciated your mom's status as a Navy veteran and as the carrier of the Eagle Staff in the United Nations Color Guard. We acquired these prints soon after we had completed building the National Native American Veterans Memorial on the grounds of the museum. And with the memorial, one of the things that we're trying to do, beyond honoring service and beyond bringing attention to the service, is to complicate the kind of the widely understood stories about Native military service, to kind of raise this idea that the service is often about protecting one's community, one's family, one's homeland, one's way of life, beyond military service. So coming back and serving leadership roles in the community, you know, maybe going into tribal leadership or other kinds of service roles, serving as protectors, you know, protecting the water protectors at Standing Rock. And so these really connected with that idea of complicating those stories, also raising awareness of the role of women and the extraordinarily high rates that Indigenous women serve in the military. And also, I saw resonance with some of the key ideas that shaped the design of the Veterans Memorial, ideas of directionality and of marking out a space for gathering and for honoring the service. And so I really appreciated the kind of the many ways that they operate within our collection, and was excited to have the opportunity to show them. And now it's just wonderful to have them on view at NMAI while your painting is on view here too.
Thank you.
It's beautiful, and it's a rich context. I feel, lucky to be a part of the Smithsonian when I listen to that and hear about the work that you're doing and that your works are doing as part of that conversation. I can speak for a moment to the context here, which is very different. So maybe we can go to this is an image of the exhibition upstairs, Revolutions. So this is kind of a hard shift in some ways, but this exhibition is meant to open up a window into the Hirshhorn Collection. The Hirshhorn is the Smithsonian Museum that is dedicated to global, modern, and contemporary art. And its collection is built upon the collection of a single individual, Josef Hirshhorn, that then has been built upon by curators over the course of the 50 years that the museum has been open. So this exhibition moves more or less chronologically from the earliest artworks represented in the Hirshhorn collection that date to around 1860, around the building, where you end with the most recent works, or works from 1960, and that's the sort of century that is spanned within the 200 plus artworks that are on view here. And as such, this becomes a snapshot of a very European American avant-garde as it's kind of pinging around and moving forward throughout that century. And as those avant-gardes are kind of grappling with one another too, because they're not always in alignment, rarely even. And then works like Dyani's are included like grace notes within this presentation. And Dyani's work in particular is included in a room that's devoted to early 20th century abstraction from a Euro-American context. And just to again set the scene very briefly, the painting on the left there is a painting by Stanton MacDonald Wright from 1914. He was an American painter who's associated with synchronism, or the movement known as synchronism. Just to the right, you see two works on paper by the French Belarusian artist Nadia Leger, who is associated with the suprematist movement and many others besides. But those two works date from the early 1920s. And then we're going to show one more image, which is just to the right of those Leger works are these two small works, early works by Josef Albers, who is the German-American artist and one of the most influential artists to work within an American context in the 20th century. He's sort of famously known for these homage to a square paintings and his exploration of color theory, which was something that he taught at Yale for decades and was very influential within that specific American context. So writ large in this room, these paintings and the paintings that surround them are all associated with different movements, but together they represent this turning away from artists who are representing the real world, quote unquote real world, and are exploring the idea of distilling that world, or distillation as a way to get at a kind of essence. And they're all doing that within their respective social and political communities, but that essence is seen to have a certain kind of potency, and that could be a poetic or a political or perhaps spiritual. And this is the context in which Dyani's work lives. And I would love to hear you speak about your reaction a bit more in depth to that specific context and this idea of distillation and what abstraction can do.
Okay. I feel like those are two points, so I'm going to try to address them both. And I have to mentally log it or I'll get lost. I think I'll speak to the distillation first. Something that I think I've been, well, not I think, that I have been pressing and utilizing my practice to create conversations within spaces like this, within writing, within opportunities for us to come together and think about art history. I utilize my practice to try to create opportunities for conversations where we're hopefully moving towards a greater, more honest storytelling. And so for me, one of the biggest flaws that I've seen in the way that the narrative has been presented thus far is that, European and European American folks have been lauded as, the makers of abstraction. And it's just not true. It's just not the truth, period. Like, abstraction is a human practice, and it's a human practice that is practiced across the globe. And it may be done in different contexts and for different purposes, but the practice of distilling very complicated ideas, our relationships, like conversations that we have in our communities about relationships amongst ourselves, relationships with the land, our relationships to the cosmos, our relationships to spirituality, all these really dense, complicated conversations. People at large take these really complicated mental conversations, whether or not they're personal conversations with yourself or conversations with your community, and they distill these complicated conversations into the most poignant, graceful expressions, artistic expressions in all different formats across the globe, and they abstract those concepts into artistic expression. That's a human practice. But it's not been presented to us in academia around the arts, at least within this country, in that plain language. And so when we go to museums that, we learn the truth from, we walk up to a wall label and we're taught that whatever's on that wall label is the education that we should be, this is the truth in the wall label, this is the truth in the text, this is the truth in all this place. It is profoundly leaving out the history of, first of all, the history of art making on this continent, pre-colonization, and at the same time as a lot of these great painters that we've been studying and are on the second floor, and our works, the works of Indigenous artists, predated that practice here. Abstraction was being done here beforehand, and it continued, and it still continues today, right? And so I like to utilize my work to lift up the history of those practices where and when I can, to remind folks to let's look at this story more expansively and talk about how we have influenced one another. Because the reality of the fact is, Indigenous art has also morphed and changed throughout time in relationship to non-Native people and non-Native communities and materials that showed up here. And you can see that everywhere. So if you look at the history and the trajectory of our artistic output, it changes throughout time. Every time new materials become available, they're brought into existing artistic practices, and the work is like rooted in its foundations, and it changes, and it evolves, and it reflects a current time and place, always, right? Western art forms, I don't even like that term. I don't like to use the term Western, and I like to use the terms Euro and American abstraction, and I like to use easel painting abstraction because it specifies a particular practice. Because I do believe abstraction is done in so many different formats, right? Weaving is a form of abstraction. The narratives that are built into that are forms of abstraction. There's so many. So distilling and abstraction, that's one thing. And then the other one that I already told you I was going to forget was...
Well, maybe I could press that a little bit, just because I think that point is important, the exchange, right?
Yes,
it's not
a
redeployment of Euro-American principles in your work as a way to, establish your practice. That is not what is happening here.
Thank
and
you.
It is important, I think, to distinguish that. So maybe you could talk about.
Well, and that's something that, and so you're going to have to remind me of the second question when we'll come back to it. But that's something that's really important to me because the vast majority of people have come up through our mainstream academic system, and art history has been taught in a particular way. We're changing that now. We've been in the practice of pushing back on that and opening up those narratives for a while now, and we've made progress. But like that change is in its infancy still, especially in regards to acknowledgement of Indigenous artists and celebration and support of Indigenous artists. It's like really, really early. But because people have a certain education, I can talk all day about my influences and my sources of inspiration and where I draw from first, and then I'll see somebody write about it and they still center American abstraction and easel painting abstraction first, and they write about it in a way that's like, you've taken modernism of abstraction and you've added Indigenous inspiration to it. Yeah, which drives me insane because it's the opposite of, for me, my life experience, it's the opposite. My education comes first and foremost from Indigenous spaces and places and forms of both informal and formal education, and then I learned Western art history. And so for me, it's actually the opposite, like I'm almost sprinkling those influences in later, like, okay, this is, but it's, and so it is not about utilizing European-born forms of abstraction and then just indigenizing them. It's about, for me, it's about recognizing it's an honest expression of my life experience, is what it is. And so, I did go to a mainstream academic space for graduate school. I did grow up in America. I did grow up in a city. I did grow up and I'm mixed. My dad's German and Welsh. My mom's Lakota. We got other things sprinkled in there that I don't even know about. It's just, that's the reality of my lived experience. I grew up raised by my mom, and I grew up in the city, but we grew up going back and forth to South Dakota. It's just, my entire life experience is an amalgamation of mainstream American influence and the specificity of who I am culturally as a Lakota woman, right? And so for me, creating the works that speak to this, these intersections, it allows me to not only speak honestly about my life path and my experiences, but allows me to pick at and point at where our artistic histories intersect, because they don't exist without one another, right? These painted forms of easel painting abstraction, they have been influenced by Indigenous art forms, both here and globally. That's a reality. Their evolution was shifted and changed in looking at Indigenous art, period. And our art forms, Indigenous art forms, have been influenced by relationships with non-Indigenous people as well, both materially and influenced from the market. And looking at other people's work. As humans, we exist in relationships. We don't exist separately, but we put them in museums as if they exist separately, which is why I'm so excited about the installation upstairs, and why I'm excited about the installation at NMAI, because I think both are very important. And I could talk to the specificity of that when we get there.
How about now? Now it's good too. We were.
That was the other part of your question.
Oh no, I think you answered it. It was just about sort of the working context and all of the complex ways that it's working. Yeah. Would you like to talk about the context at NMAI a little bit?
Yeah.
And then maybe if we have time for one or two questions.
Yeah, I can make it brief. I'm really excited that the work is in both spaces, and I think it's really important that it's in both spaces. A lot of times, for Native artists, we have not had the kind of mainstream support as a lot of our peers. Well, we still don't, but it's changing. And so we have collectively built a field that supports ourselves and each other, right? And that's how many Indigenous artists have survived as artists for a long time, through our own field that we've built ourselves. And that deserves the recognition and the support and the, it's a beautiful thing, right? And it's been something out of necessity in a lot of ways. People have asked me, so over the years, because of that, like, you can survive as an Indigenous artist solely within the Native arts field. You can do that. I want to do both, and I think both are important. And I don't think, I don't think Native people should be secluded to the spaces that are built just for them. I don't think Black people should be secluded to the spaces that are built just for them. I don't think Asian people should be secluded to the spaces that are built just for them. And I think that the spaces that are built just for them and everybody else are equally as important, right? Like, it is important that we take moments to recognize the richness of a particular culture and the gifts that it gives to humanity. It is important to look at that specifically and be like, look at all this beauty that comes from this particular group of people and the way that they've lived together and the things that they've brought into life, and what can we learn from this particular community? What should we celebrate? Like, that's so special, right? And it's needed and it's important. And I love to be exhibited amongst my peers and amongst my relatives and amongst the works that, like, have raised me, right? That, like, have filled my heart and my soul in so many ways. Like, I always want to be exhibited in those spaces. And I deserve to be exhibited in the contemporary art spaces, as do all my peers. Thank you. But not only that, like, we should be, right? Like, there shouldn't be a separation, but there has been. There has been. And the Native people have not had the blessing of being able to walk into spaces like the Hirshhorn and see works by our peers until very recently, So that I work really hard for that, because I know that as humans, like, we all deserve that. These are our public art spaces, so they should reflect the public. We should all be able to have the gift of walking into a museum and seeing our relatives, seeing our lives reflected in an artwork. Being able to connect to an artwork is such a profound experience. And it's one of these experiences that it's like, it's soul-filling in a way that very few things offer us. Like, when we stand in front of a waterfall, or we stand in a forest, or we stand at the ocean front, whatever that is, like, you get that sense of awe and, like, that nurturing of your spirit. Like, art does that for us too, right? And we all crave it. That's why we keep coming back. We crave it, we need it, it's important, and we should all be able to connect with it in ways that feel like they speak to who we are as a people, to our lineage, to our communities, to our families. Like, we all deserve that, everybody. And so I work really hard to make sure that not only my work, but the work of my peers too, is recognized and celebrated in all of those spaces, in the spaces that are built specifically to reflect our communities, and in the greater conversation of human artistic production. It should be everywhere. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.